Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Expanded Realities Conversations. My name is Harger, and I'm the Executive Director of Art Science Museum here in Singapore. Welcome to the third talk of the Expanded Realities Conversation series. It's an online conference that explores how artists are working with immersive media and extended reality technologies, such as virtual reality. Tonight's talk is part of the museum's online program, Art Science at Home, and is streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. I am thrilled to be joined today by one of the art world's most important curatorial voices, Daniel Birnbaum. Daniel is currently Artistic Director of Acute Art, an art agency that develops new work by contemporary artists using digital technologies such as virtual reality. Tonight's talk coincides with the launch of Art Science Museum's new virtual reality gallery. Our VR gallery opened this month to mark the museum's 10th anniversary. It's one of the first of its kind in Southeast Asia and will present a rolling program of cutting-edge VR projects by artists, filmmakers, and scientists. We launched the gallery with Hyperrealities, a program of VR artworks by three of the most influential artists of our time, Marina Abramović, Olafur Eliasson, and Anish Kapoor. This program was made possible through a partnership with Acute Art, which Daniel leads. Acute Art brings together renowned international artists and new technology to produce and exhibit cutting-edge visual artworks. The company acts as a digital art laboratory, exploring new mediums for experimental art making. Shortly, Daniel will speak about Acute Art's collaborations with artists, the power of immersive media, and what all this means for the arts in the future. After Daniel's talk, we'll have a Q&A and we'll take questions from you. We'd love to know who's with us today, so please do come onto the comments section, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook. Say hello and let us know where you're watching from today. And then later on, if you have questions for Daniel, just pop them into the comments of the stream and we'll see them as they come in. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Daniel Birnbaum. Daniel is one of the world's leading curators. From 2010 to 2018, he was the director of the Moderna Museet, the Museum of Modern Art in Sweden, where he's calling from today. Prior to that, he was the director of the 2009 Venice Biennial, the 2008 Yokohama Triennial, and the 2005 Moscow Biennial, amongst many other curatorial achievements. He's also curated major exhibitions at museums around the world, including the Centre Pompidou in Paris, Martin Gropiusbau in Berlin, and the Serpentine in London. Daniel is also a noted art critic and theoretician, and has authored numerous essays for publications, including Art Forum and Frieze, as well as publishing important works of philosophy and art theory. In 2018, when Daniel announced that he was leaving Moderna Museet to pursue a curatorial practice with artists working with virtual reality, it sent a strong message to the art world that digital technologies were transforming the arts. We've been thrilled to work alongside him and his team on the program for our new VR gallery, and we're delighted that he agreed to take part in the Expanded Realities online talk series, which examines new art forms made possible by immersive media. To speak about his work with Acute Art and their stable of artists, it's my privilege to welcome Daniel Birnbaum. Daniel.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this very, very generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be part of your program, and I'm so happy about our collaboration. So we are actually showing three works right now in Singapore, and it's three virtual reality pieces, as already mentioned, one by Olafur Eliasson, one by Anish Kapoor, and one by Marina Abramović. So yes, I come from a very traditional, in a way, art background. I've always been interested in new media, of course, and I've written a lot about video art. I wrote a little book back in the 90s when all of that seemed relatively new. And it's interesting to see how the introduction of new visual technologies actually can change not only art production, but actually also institutions and the curatorial practices. And I will talk a little bit about our productions, but I will also ask questions that I'm not 100% sure that I can answer myself, having to do with our moment. It seems in a way that the pandemic fast-forwarded certain developments. Here we are. I'm in Stockholm. I arrived from London, and you are probably a little bit everywhere. And we have the show in Singapore, and all of this is getting normal. We're so used to having conferences and meetings online. That wasn't really the case 2 years ago. And I think certain changes that were on their way, as I said, were kind of somehow speeded up through our condition here. Art and technology is, of course, not a new conversation. Art and technology has always been, in dialogue. Every art form uses some sort of technology, and in the 19th century or the 20th century, let's say, we've seen a number of paradigm shifts. The introduction of, let's say, photography in the mid 19th century led to entirely new possibilities, and then we had the cinema, and after cinema, at some point, the video camera was introduced, and television, and then came the internet, and all of these incredible revolutions in technology led to new forms of art and new forms of displaying art. And in our century, I guess, we now see the introduction of a new medium, or perhaps a cluster of new mediums that are all related: augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality. And from a technological point of view, they are all very almost the same. Some of the technologists, some of the engineers that I work with would say, but of course, it's a huge difference if you see things alone in a headset, or if you can place things in the city and look at it through a telephone or an iPad with others. But it's some sort of revolution. And think about previous chapters of this art and technology dialogue. For instance, the introduction of photography led to all kinds of speculative statements and exaggerations and a lot of confusion. What is photography? No one knew when it came. Would it kind of destroy painting? Would it create new forms of spiritual art? What is photography? Is it science, or is it more of a some sort of esoteric science? And there's always a little window of a few years when such questions are asked before things become a bit more normal and mainstream, and sooner or later often a bit commercialized. And I think we're in that window of experimentation right now when it comes to AR and VR and related technologies. For specialists, of course, these things are not entirely new. A long time ago, I was a teacher and even a dean of an art school in Germany, in Frankfurt. And at that school, the Städelschule, had a little institute for new media. This is around 1990. The people who worked there, the leading person there was Peter Weibel, who then took his interest to Karlsruhe, where they established an entirely new center for new media art. And back then, I remember there were conversations in the little art school. I was just one of the teachers in the 90s, and not everyone agreed that it's important to introduce new electronic media. I remember even not fights, but quite strong arguments against it, that it would all be electronic kitsch and things like that. And we had another colleague there called Peter Kubelka, leading experimental filmmaker, who started the Anthology Film Archive in New York, and was he's still around, but an old man now. And he said it's more important to learn how to cook. This is more interesting than to produce what he said called electronic kitsch with the tools of the military complex. Well, I have to say, and he would have classes about baking bread and things like that. And I would say that most of my life I've maybe been more on the baking bread side of things than producing digital art. But today I think it's no longer a possibility to pretend that we aren't surrounded by these possibilities all the time. Besides your piece of bread on your breakfast table, you probably have an iPhone or something similar, and we live with that. It's become part of our everyday life in a way that wasn't even possible to imagine 25 years ago. At the museum where I worked for almost a decade, the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, we did a lot of things having to do with art and technology. And we did a little show with the German pioneers Kraftwerk, the musicians, the band. And I remember actually quite recently I came across a book about Kraftwerk written in the early 90s. And it opens up with something they call a dream sequence, and the two founding members, Ralf Hütter and Florian Schneider, who founded Kraftwerk, they were also bicycle fans. They would go bicycling in the mountains, and they imagined stopping on a mountain pass and taking out miniature computers that they would carry in their pockets, and they would trigger concerts in many places at the same time. So with a special code, they would launch simultaneous concerts in Madrid, Paris, Berlin, Moscow, London, Amsterdam, Rome, and Stockholm. And in each of these cities, a group of pre-programmed robots would perform Kraftwerk's music. This actually never happened, but it's a kind of legend that they actually did do shows or concerts in several cities at the same time. It all sounded so futuristic, but this futuristic dream, which is now 30 years ago, is maybe no longer so very revolutionary. We all actually do carry mini computers in our pockets, very powerful tools. And we have access to innumerable globally distributed cultural events, like this little lecture right now. It's maybe not quite as exciting as a fantastic electronic rock concert, but it's distributed, and one can participate all over the world. Today, we wouldn't need any pre-programmed mannequins or robots. We could use AR or VR instead. So the question is, will today's immersive technologies actually change and expand the ways we experience art? Can these tools be helpful in an art world that wants to keep the global conversation alive, perhaps without the frantic traveling and the shipping of objects? This is one of the questions that I would like to discuss, and I will also present some of the works that we have produced, and I will show you a little bit of backstage material, how these works are produced. And the three works that are now on display in Singapore, again by Olafur, Eliasson, Anish, Kapoor, and Marina Abramović. We have small films, and maybe we can take a little look at this. I will disappear, but I will keep talking, and it's a 5-minute clip here. And here is actually material from the production of Marina Abramović's piece. Marina's piece, which is called Rising, has to do with the climate issues. It was actually launched here in Stockholm as part of a conference created by the Nobel Prize Foundation, and it was all about issues such as global warming and climate the climate crisis. Marina's piece is, as always, centered around her. I mean, she's a performance artist, and it's always Marina and her own body at the center. But it's almost like a little game, the piece. It's about saving Marina, but it's actually also about saving planet Earth. So this was the first piece, or one of the first pieces that we produced. So Acute Art is a studio, basically, or kind of a laboratory, because sometimes we're testing new things that we don't really know if they will work and what they will look like. So just like any other atelier, it's a kind of experimental site. We're in London, in the Somerset House, a big building, very centrally located down at the Thames, at the river. And our idea is actually to produce works with the artists that maybe wouldn't have had access to these visual possibilities if we wouldn't be involved. In a way, maybe one can maybe say a few words about this, that, you know, artists, of course, have always embraced new techniques, and yet one cannot say that the art world's dominant attitude towards modern technology has been one of only of enthusiasm. Even if the last century saw moments of techno-optimism, from, let's say, Italian futurism and Russian constructivism to people like Nam June Paik in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and movements, an interesting movement actually called EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, that involved some of the key artists of that moment, of the 60s, including Robert Rauschenberg and choreographers like Merce Cunningham and also John Cage and many other key artists from that period, especially from the US. EAT happened mainly in New York, but then it spread out and became an almost global movement with members all over the world. And they did, for instance, a famous exhibition in Japan. And EAT, for those of you interested in the history of art and technologies, maybe an interesting place to begin if one wants to understand what it is that we're trying to do. It's a bit bombastic to claim that we would be a new EAT, because that was a very, very important movement that really included key artists. But I would say our ambition is similar, because EAT actually introduced new technical tools to artists to see what happens if these people, even Andy Warhol was part of it, have access to this. So in a way, it's a bit similar. And here you see Anish Kapoor, who has produced a very interesting, I think, a beautiful journey. It's hard to really understand what it is. It's called Falling Within. And in a way, Anish takes you on a journey through your own body, perhaps, but then you enter a space which is maybe no longer bodily, but rather perhaps the soul. And I think there are even, notions of reincarnation or some sort of circular idea of being born and dying as as part of a bigger cycle. Now I start interpreting this piece, but you should all please have a look at it. I think it's a very interesting piece that clearly would never have happened had we not introduced this new virtual reality medium to Anish. We saw a quick, we got a quick glimpse also of Olafur Eliasson, an artist who is always exploring visual possibilities and optical machineries in his art. He is an installation artist working with with the with space and light, and he was also one of the first artists that we involved, and we have been working with Olafur in all along. And I will get back to Olafur because we've done augmented reality pieces also. They all had different reasons to join us and to explore this new medium. It's not that every artist has the same the same reason at all. I would say here we have a slide, a still from another piece, one of the very first pieces that we showed actually at Moderna Museet, and a virtual reality piece by Jeff Koons, the sculptor. And as I think you all know, Jeff is an incredible perfectionist. Nothing in the world is perfect enough, basically. Everything that, every object is so unbelievably, shiny and perfect that, virtual reality for him was probably, offered a kind of a possibility to create a ballerina that is more perfect than any object he could have done out of metal. So these were the first virtual reality works that we did. Jeff Koons, Marina Abramović, Olafur Eliasson, Anish Kapoor, Anthony Gormley. I'm not showing this piece now, but it's also a beautiful work that we did with Gormley and an astrophysicist called Priya Natarajan, a close colleague and friend of Anthony's. And then we have worked with many other artists, younger artists, of course, also, like Natalie Djurberg, a Swedish sculptor and filmmaker. We have worked with Bjarne Melgaard, a Norwegian total artist who's done, everything from architecture to painting to sculpture, a very strange kind of hallucinatory journey. And we have continued working with the artists who are actually maybe closer to the world of technology, like Cao Fei, for instance. Cao Fei, a Chinese artist who has always been interested in the latest possibilities that new digital technologies provide. I remember 10 years ago, no more, maybe 15 years ago, she was already exploring Second Life, and she created a whole city in Second Life, and people appeared there, including me, actually. I was an avatar in in that early piece. So, Cao Fei has much more knowledge about the digital world than maybe a classical sculptor like Anthony Gormley. And that's another piece that, at some point, I hope we can present. So VR is maybe the most overwhelming of mediums. It's Douglas Copeland, the American writer, talked about it as the medium that could, delete or kill all other mediums. It's so strong that it makes even cinema seem humble. You're immersed, a very kind of key concept when describing these kinds of works. It's beyond objects, it's beyond pictures. You're in it. You become part of the world. You become part of the work. And you cannot escape it. You're inside, a space that has no windows, no doors, no exits. You're totally inside it. And it's an entirely new form of art that maybe was anticipated by some artists. It's interesting to think that, sometimes it's almost as if artists are doing things where they anticipate possibilities that become real with the introduction of new technologies that maybe don't exist yet. Actually, Walter Benjamin, the influential German Jewish theorists from the 1920s and 30s, in his most legendary text on reproduction, or the possibility of reproducing art pieces, basically a text about photography and cinema, he talks there about how artists are trying to do what is not possible yet. How, in an almost prophetic way, some artists are trying to realize things that maybe the introduction of a new medium will make possible. It's interesting how many artists have been doing immersive installations without VR. Think about James Turrell, or think about Kusama, and actually Olafur also. So in a way, the VR makes possible things that have been, hinted at and attempted in other forms. Let's move on and look a little bit at other slides. In the middle of the lockdown, or actually on the day when American museums closed, I was in New York, and we launched a piece which was not a VR piece, but an AR piece, an augmented reality piece, with an artist called KAWS. KAWS is not his real name, KAWS. KAWS' real name is Brian Donnelly, and he's has a background in street art and graffiti, and he did more or less illegal things as a very young man, and created artworks all along in the city and on billboards, and then he became more and more successful and started to work with brands. And he has created a number of very recognizable characters that appear everywhere in his art. This little figure is called the Companion, and it exists in basically every medium. And we helped him to create an augmented reality version of his piece. And it was placed in cities all over the world, actually in 12 cities at the same time. And people could see it through the telephone. And when you take photos of it, it looks very real. Like here you see London and the Louvre in Paris. And the figure hangs there. And if you take a photo of your friends with it, you can't really be 100% sure if the person is maybe in augmented reality or KAWS piece. And it became a more or less viral success, I would say, or at least very visible all over the world, because people like KAWS. And for us, it was the beginning of a new way to work. We didn't stop exploring VR, but suddenly all the museums were closed, and no one wants to put on a headset, and there were no ways to show the VR. And so we concentrated on augmented reality productions and augmented reality exhibitions even. KAWS was the first ambitious show. We can move on to the next slide, please. We did an augmented reality project with Olafur also. So, Olafur is an artist who is very interested in natural phenomena, in light and in the elements, basically. And we produced a little cloud that rains, and a bird and flowers, and a little insect, and a rock, and a sun. And people could actually activate this at home. We developed an app, and if you haven't seen that, so I would recommend that you download. It's free. Our app called Acute Art, where through which you can see some of the exhibitions that we have in different parts of the world, but you can also place small versions of the pieces in your home. So when in the middle of the lockdown, we created this interactive Wunderkammer show. Wunderkammer is a German word for curiosity cabinet. So all the kind of things that are out there and that we take for granted are actually quite wondrous, such as clouds and birds and rocks. And Olafur proposed this as a little miniature kind of exhibition that everyone could do in their own home. And you could document it next to your friends, or your pets, or your grandmother, or your boyfriend, and share it. And people did. And I have to say that it became one of the most visible things I have ever worked with. It reached a much bigger audience than anything actually that I had ever worked with, including the Venice Biennale. So it shows the potential of these new mediums. Next slide, please. It's also a way to do intervention art, whatever that means. I mean, graffiti is a form of intervention, of course, but there were maybe more theoretical approaches and more political approaches to this. For instance, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a group in France called the Situationists, and they were very interested in intervening, in kind of changing public space, changing appropriating and somehow changing changing the meaning of things through small slight alterations and adding a little bit or mixing things. I think that AR is a fantastic medium for interventions in public space. It can be public art without anything being installed, without anything being shipped, and it can be visually very, very strong. Nina Chanel is an American artist who has become rather visible in the last years. She's a painter, also with some sort of background in murals, maybe more than graffiti actually, but one has the sense that it's, she has a closeness to certain aspects of street art. But now she's doing paintings that have become, enormously attractive in the art market. I know, very expensive things. And we are not involved with her doing physical things, but we created this spiritual leader, the spiritual friend. Imaginary Friend is the title of the piece actually. And it's a kind of religious person, perhaps. Maybe it's a Black Jesus. Nina has been very politically involved in movements such as Black Lives Matter, and we actually launched this Black Jesus-like figure in Washington, and you can see it here on the picture. It's part of a march, a kind of anti-racist march, that was called "Get Your Knees Off Our Neck." And of course, it's a piece that gets a very different meaning depending on in which context it's shown. It's now been shown in many places, and you can actually place it yourself, and people put it, where they think it's where it should be. I noticed that people have placed this maybe a little bit as some sort of critical comment here and there, reminding everyone of racial struggles and so on. So it's a kind of it's an example of public art. I mean, we've done many things in the public, but here I think it's really about creating dialogues with the monuments and with buildings that have political meaning, or it's just an example. So if we could move on, please. Here's Cao Fei. We have done a quite, I think, maybe the most sophisticated virtual reality piece that we've been involved with is her kind of retro-futuristic journey into some sort of a digital sphere. It's actually a piece about technology. Cao Fei's own studio happens to be in a part of Beijing where they developed early computers, and the early kind of computation of China was, at least in this case, a collaboration with Russian scientists. And she has created this virtual reality journey that is also a love story between a Russian and a Chinese scientist. The little boy that appears is actually a replica of Cao Fei's own son. And we showed this for the first time at the Serpentine Gallery in London as part of a bigger survey show. But then, came COVID, and they had to close the museum. Every museum in the Western world, at least, was suddenly closed. So then we did a AR version of it. One, located so that you could, they could open the show again after a few months, and then one, but they couldn't have headsets there. So we created something that one could see on the phone. And we have also done elements from the piece as part of this interactive app, so that you can place the little boy in your kitchen if you want. It's actually still there, so please try it out. Next slide, please. Yes, so now I have 2 or 3 more slides, I think, and they're all about bigger shows that we have produced. We did an augmented reality show in China at the UCCA with, I think, 7 works. And that was interesting that it was produced, remotely. I was the curator, whatever that means. Not quite sure what that exactly that concept implies in AR, but I was in my kitchen in London and we placed AR objects in China, and then we decided to actually also do do a big version in London. All the museums were closed. Everything was very boring. There was nothing to do in London, but the only thing one could do was to go on long walks. No restaurant was open, no cafe, nothing. So we placed 35 AR objects along the River Thames. So you could walk from Waterloo Bridge to Tate Modern, and we placed works by 10 or 11 artists. You can see a few examples here. A giant spider by Thomas Saraceno. You see The Boy by Cao Fei and KAWS and Nina Chanel, and a huge sun by Olafur, and strange-looking characters that have escaped the paintings of Bjarne Melgaard. There were a few other artists, and this was something that people explored, walking along the river, and you could only see it on the telephone or on iPads if you wanted a bigger image. But most people just looked at it through their telephones, and then they took photos of themselves with these or of their friends and shared them, and it became quite a kind of popular thing. It showed us new possibilities again for exhibitions. I saw it almost as a kind of electronic biennial placed in the city. It was for free for everyone, and since then we have been doing a number of similar things. And next slide, please. We have a very large show right now in New York. It's a collaboration with an institution called The Shed, and with this interesting thing called the High Line. For those of you who have been in New York, you have probably walked on the High Line. The High Line is a little bit of an art institution itself. It has an art program. We have placed many works, including a few works by artists that we have added, like Precious Okumon, who's done these flowers that you can see there. They read poetry. You can see this big lady, kind of giant, by Darren Bader. The Cheese Man, the strange-looking characters, is Bjarne Melgaard. The Rock is by Olafur. But there are 11 artists, I think, and they're placed around the Shed and on the High Line. And the whole thing is a collaboration between these 3 institutions, if you want, Acute Art, the Shed, and the High Line. And Cecilia Alemani, who is the curator of the High Line, and Emma Enderby, who is the chief curator of the Shed, have placed these works. I couldn't go. And I think that maybe these possibilities give us a sense, perhaps, of future institutional changes. We couldn't travel, and maybe the whole kind of frantic traveling that has been so much part of the art world will never come back. I don't know what will change, what will not change. Many people have seen the pandemic as a little bit of a, what do you call it, a dress rehearsal for a bigger crisis, or a bigger revolution, or a bigger change, namely the climate crisis. And maybe in the future it's no longer an attractive idea to travel to another continent for a few days, ship art there in crates, ship it back home. I've been part of that world. I've been very much part of that world for the last 25 years, going to festivals and biennials and art fairs in distant countries. Then you fly back home after a few days. I think that world belonged to a certain period, and I would say it wasn't normal in the 60s to fly to Asia from Europe just for a few days. And it became part of the art world that we had all these festivals everywhere. I don't think that they will disappear, but it's maybe not a given that all of them will survive if they don't transform. And I'm thinking that maybe these mediums that we're talking about here, augmented reality, mixed reality, virtual reality, might be part of some future structure of the art world that we haven't really seen yet. This is only, early days and perhaps more of a bit of a premonition of things to come. Thank you so much. These were simply a few examples. I'm very happy if there are comments or questions, and I'll do my best to.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for that fascinating presentation, for giving us an insight into acute arts work, but also setting it in that kind of wider context. That was really insightful. For those of you who are watching online, we're currently live online at Art Science at Home, the online program of Art Science Museum, streaming live on YouTube and Facebook. And we're really keen to hear from you. So if you have comments or questions or kind of just some feedback that you'd like to share with Daniel, just pop your comments into the comment section of YouTube or Facebook, and I'll see them and pick them up, and we'll weave them into our Q&A. Maybe we could just start off together, Daniel. It was a wonderful introduction to acute arts work, and I really enjoyed seeing the full depth and breadth of the organization's practice. But I wanted to ask you a personal question to kick us off. Obviously, when you made the decision to leave Moderna Musik to helm the acute art team in the form of the artistic director role, it caused quite a stir within the art world. So I wonder if you could just start by speaking a little bit about what inspired you to move from leading a major modern art museum to working with virtual reality artworks.
Well, in a way, I maybe surprised myself a little bit also. I have been privileged or lucky in a way in my so-called career or professional life that I've been doing is slightly different things. I mean, I really started out as a writer and a journalist and a critic, and then I became friends with artists and started to help them to do shows. And one thing led to another, so that I worked for different kinds of institutions. So I worked for an art school for a decade, and I curated biennials in during many years, not only biennials but big group shows and so on. And then finally I became the director of a museum. I hadn't really been a museum person before that, so there has been changes before. And so in a way I just thought that if I can continue to learn new things rather than just do the same, even if there's always wonderful new artists that you can show and another museum that maybe you can work for. I just thought that this was a radically new possibility that I would like to explore. Some people have said that maybe it's too early. Maybe these mediums, will develop, but it's simply too early. But I actually do think that it's interesting to be very early. That moment of experimentation that I mentioned, that's at the beginning of my little talk, I think we're in that right now. Maybe in the future things will be more mainstream and defined and commercialized and all of that. And I wouldn't say that then it's too late, but I think interesting years are actually these years when these things are being tested and introduced. And I mentioned this movement EAT in conferences about art and technology. They're always mentioned, and they were not only successful. I mean, the chief technician there was actually a Swedish person called Billy Cleaver. He became more American, but I met him at the press conference. I made an interview with him once, actually, a long time ago, and he reminded everyone of the fact that some of their big exhibitions that they did, for instance, in the US, they were not very positively received at all, but they were interesting. They were simply, they were prophetic to a certain extent, that they were testing things that no one had done yet. And Billy Cleaver's archives Moderna Museet was actually one of the important institutions for that movement, not as important as things in New York, but we had some of the key works by Rauschenberg, and we had all the films, and we did a lot about EAT. And I started to think that John Cage is fantastic, but it's actually 60 years ago. it becomes slightly nostalgic to go on about things that happened in 1966. What would a similar conversation be today? And then came this offer from Acute. I was already involved a little bit as their advisor. They wanted to, reach out to important artists and very important artists, people who have, shown that they are key for the art world in general. So, the first ones as are actually the ones that you are showing now. And Stockholm is not the center of the world, but it's an interesting place also for technology. And it's not Silicon Valley, but there is Skype and there is Spotify, and they're both located in Stockholm initiatives. Ericsson, that more or less launched the telephone as a commercial possibility, is Swedish. So I always try to get those kind of, as a museum director, it's your job to kind of find new collaborations and support and money and whatnot. So I was always thinking that we should be closer to that tech world. We didn't really manage so much, even if we did a few things. And there was a conference organized by Spotify where I introduced artists. And it was during that period that, I became part of this group of people who, initiated Acute Art. It's a private initiative, but now it's many people involved, and some of the artists even. It's a company, but it's maybe a strange company because it's really trying things that are rather experimental rather than just commercializing things. But so then I was simply asked if could you not do this for a little while, and I guess what you refer to as some sort of surprise in the art world was the moment when I said okay. But I just felt that I could have stayed at the museum a few more years or worked for some other museum, but I have to say I don't regret it. I think it's an interest. Of course, I didn't know that there would be a pandemic that would close all the museums anyhow. So maybe timing-wise, it was quite my timing was at least good.
It was uncanny. I was very struck with your reference to experiments in art and technology as well. And it's been very clear to us as we've been working with your team at Acute Art that the desire of both these organizations, EAT and Acute Art, is to kind of create these kind of encounters between well-known artists of the era, kind of Cage, Namjoon Pike, kind of Miss Cunningham and the like in the 60s, and Olafur, Anish, Marina kind of today, with new technological innovation. So I was really glad to hear you speak about that, kind of as being a point of inspiration. We've got a lot of questions from the floor, so I'm going to go straight kind of to the first few that we have. We've got two which are connected, one from Constantine and the other from Desmond, which talk about what you foresee to be perhaps kind of new trends that might be kind of emerging within the space of kind of immersive arts. What do you see as being kind of, I guess, your prediction of what might happen next with art and technology collaborations, and how might new roles emerge kind of within this space for curators?
Well, it's clear that there are a few developments that somehow seem to be parallel developments. There is a kind of new institutional possibility. You can see the Atelier Lumière in France, and what people from Pace Gallery are doing, as they call it, Super Blue. They are developing immersive art spaces, and in a way, I would say we had that already. I'm just thinking of some of the shows, even shows that I was involved with, like a big Kusama show, or a very large Olafur Eliasson show, or think about the things that James Turrell has been doing for the last 50 years. But they're pushing this even further into very sensational kind of realms. And that's clearly a development, and it's a commercial development. It's a way to commercialize art without selling art objects, but rather selling experiences. And that's an interesting thing, of course, if you're part of the commercial art world, that I'm curious how this will develop. And I can see similar initiatives, that are actually go far beyond the art world. That you can do immersive experiences about anything, about the ocean, or about the space, or about the foreign civilizations, and I think that will come. It's not really what I'm personally so interested in, but I can see that this is a strong development, and I think that it will continue. And there was a conference a little bit like our conversation right now that I was part of at the Städelschule, the art academy in Frankfurt, just a few weeks ago. It was called Breaking Glass, this conference has actually happened 3 or 4 times now, 3 times I think, and it's been about these technical possibilities. But I would say, for the first time, it was actually they're online actually, these conversations, and we had Elizabeth Diller from Diller Scofidio, who is one of the world's most influential architects, especially for us in the art world. She has done art, ICA in Boston. She's done things in California, the extension of MoMA, the Shed, the High Line. She's really, at the center of things. And then she reminded, because I asked her actually for someone who's really built the art world, what could the institutional shifts be like? What would she think that, the Shed is her last big art, the extension of MoMA, I guess, is her last big thing in the art world. And then, towards the end of her conversation, she started to think about more flexible structures. Maybe we don't need a big building in the future. Maybe we need many small sheds in the forests of Japan and Scandinavia and the US and all over spread. And, at some point, maybe one can ask, do we even need a building at all? But, maybe there are new forms of, to continue our global conversation. It's so easy to make fun of certain superficial tendencies of globalization, and everything is everyone traveling around without any meaning and all of that. But at the same time, the pandemic has made clear that we do want to continue some sort of conversation, and I can only think that these exhibitions that we've done using AR could maybe be a first glimpse of possibilities that are very local and global at the same time. One tends to think of digital things as somehow being everywhere and nowhere at the same time, but one can actually locate things. That's what we do with these AR things. So maybe there could be some sort of future art world. I'm now really just speculating and dreaming here, but where things happen a little bit like that Kraftwerk example of mine, with concerts taking place in different parts of the world at the same time. Maybe there can be networks of institutional, collaborative kind of structures that don't need buildings like the Metropolitan or MoMA or even the Shed, but actually lighter things that are somehow part of a future formation that is not the art world that we knew, not the Biennale art fair model that we have lived with now for around 25 years. Maybe there's something coming, but I'm as curious as everyone else what that might be. But I do think that these technologies will be part of it.
Well, that actually segues quite nicely onto the next question we've got from our audience. This one's from Rupert Thompson from the Arts House in Singapore, who made the observation that the experience of setting up a space with the VR headsets kind of is always a bit theatrical. And his question is have you worked with artists who are kind of almost exploring amplifying that theatricality and extending the immersion beyond that digital core?
Yeah, headsets are still kind of appalling and ugly, most of them. I think they're actually getting better. I did a small VR show for Frieze for the art fair, but they always do these non-commercial things too, with conferences and curatorial experiments. And this is now 2 years ago, Frieze New York, and I simply put 6 quite elegant chairs that can rotate in a kind of gray and white space, and we showed some of our works there in wireless Oculus headsets. and people looked kind of beautiful in there. And it was, I actually looking at people looking at art is, a special hobby of the art world. And I think many people actually thought that the space looked kind of interesting. All these people, no one left. The program was half an hour, so I was almost surprised that I thought people in New York would have a very short attention span, but they were actually, gone for half an hour, and they looked at some of our works and a few other works that I introduced by Rachel Rossin and other quite interesting younger artists, and that's an example of the setup, or let's say the architecture of the show being important, because it is sometimes not really very attractive looking. I remember a VR piece that a friend of mine produced. We were not involved, but I'm quite friendly with Dominique Gonzalez-Förster, a French artist, and I thought she made a marvelous installation as part of the Venice Biennale. Looked very poetic. The whole setup looked like some sort of seance from the late 18th century, 19th century maybe, some sort of theosophical society or something. And we have done this show with Anthony Gormley and his friend, the astrophysicist. And for them, it was very important that you were, you were greeted by people who explained what was going to happen, almost as if you would be on your way to enter an airplane or a rocket, because the piece is actually about the moon. So it was really a journey to the moon, and you were, introduced by very friendly guides, and you sat on a bench, and they had created a beautiful space. And that's an example. Another example of things that I have been involved with is the Cao Fei piece, because that is very much a kind of almost seamless transition from physical to virtual. I think she's maybe the artist that has done that in the most attractive way that I'm aware of. It's about her studio. Everything circles around her studio and her historical research into her own studio, and what that building was, an old cinema in a part of Beijing where computers were developed early on. And so everything starts in her kitchen. So at the Serpentine Gallery, and also in Beijing, I didn't see that show, and I think we will show it again in Rome very soon. The actual physical kitchen as a kind of stage set is built there. So you enter her kitchen, and there's her kitchen table with an old newspaper and an almanac, and very, very, very basic scenography, a stage set basically. And then you put on the headset, and you're still in the same kitchen. Of course, it's a virtual replica of the kitchen, but you're still in the same space when the journey begins. And then, anything can happen, and it's really a sci-fi-like experience with strange things happening and, very unreal, surreal developments. But when you're finished, you're back in the kitchen, first in the virtual, you take off the headset, and you're still in the kitchen. And it's actually kind of very beautiful kind of a journey, mixing realities in a way that is, that is maybe linked to that other question, like, could one do collaborative things where physical spaces are linked? I felt that show could have happened in many places at the same time. We could have had those, very cell-like basic kitchens in everywhere in the world. And of course, this is a solitary experience, but imagine there, we start doing this in multiplayer versions of it, where people can be, together also. That's, of course, something. Actually, that's something I should have said. About the question of future developments, I do think that social VR will develop in different ways, and it's already happening. And there are all these chat groups where people can join VR worlds. But I would be surprised if we don't see kind of multiplayer versions of VR in the art world too soon.
And that, I think, touches quite nicely on Datu's question, which specifically asks that question around, are we going to see kind of virtual reality artworks that add in these elements of interactivity? I think with Marina's work, which already has simple aspects of interactivity, and Cao Fei's work, where the interaction is with the environment, that trend is absolutely already emerging. And we had another question in there around kind of, these, I guess, evolution starting to kind of come into that social space. So, yeah, I'm sure we're both in agreement that these are trends which will certainly kind of evolve as the technology gets a little bit more sophisticated. We're getting to the end of our time. We've got time for just one last question. And I want to end really by perhaps kind of sharing some thoughts on the future. It's difficult to have a conversation about the future these days without addressing the impact of the pandemic. And you've mentioned a couple of times that COVID-19, of course, has hit kind of artists and art institutions particularly hard, but there's also been opportunities opening up for artists and curators such as yourselves who had already pivoted into digital technology. So perhaps we could just end with some thoughts on kind of what your plans are for the future, and you know, kind of perhaps you know, sort of what you expect might happen kind of with the art world kind of over the next few months.
Well, not so easy. I mean, it seems like things are opening up again, and you know, you know, museums are open in London and in I think everywhere in Europe now. But it's and I've been, you know, very eager to go to all these things, and I've been, you know, even in the darkest moments when, you know, suddenly some museums were open in London, and I of course booked and went, and it's been a bit gloomy also, you know, that you go there alone with a mask and you look at the things and there's no cafe and there's no one there, and then you exit and you go home. It's a very kind of solitary, strange thing, the whole charm of the art world. I guess, you know, I don't think that the future of the art world will be digital, or you know, I think it will be what one refers to as hybrid. You know, that it will be both. And you know, there's a gloomy idea that, you know, in the future we can stream VR, of course, probably in the next couple of years, and then, you know, why have an institution at all? You can just sit at home with your headset. But that is maybe not what I am, you know, hoping for. I think, you know, the art world as I know it, and the attractiveness and the charm of it all is that we like the social exchange, and people like going to serious seminars, but they also like to go to not very serious openings and opening dinners and after parties and all of that. And it's part of, you know, it's part of what makes the whole thing fun, that you exchange and you disagree or you agree and you compare notes. And so I don't think that, you know, the virtual world can replace all of that. But I do think, again, that we can maybe see future possibilities where things are, you know, linked through these instruments. I would be, you know, I think that a certain kind of localism, you know, you know, insisting on more local scenes is something that will, I can already see it actually, that people, you know, there are all kinds of interesting small initiatives in the countryside of Sweden or something, when artists have, you know, and probably everywhere. But I think, you know, it's also dangerous if local things can also become provincial, and provincial can become rather nationalistic or a little bit, you know, stubbornly insisting only on your own thing. So I think that that kind of, yeah, localism can be beautiful, but it can also lead to bad developments, I would think. So I think for people like myself who like some sort of international conversation, I'm hoping that things like, yeah, this conference right now, this little, it's kind of extraordinary. I had never done that 2 years ago. And now we do it almost every day in one way or another. So I think even visually meager platforms like Zoom have pointed us in a direction that, you know, there will be these hybrid spaces. And I think it was actually Mark Spiegler, the director of the Art Basel, who said that, you know, a little bit of a critique perhaps of all the online viewing rooms that all the big galleries have done, that cannot be the future. But the future of the art world will not be digital or virtual, but it will not be only physical either. It will be these new forms of hybridity. And that's very vague what I now say, but it's kind of the only thing I can come up with at the moment.
But I think it's actually a really wise point, because you touched earlier when you were sharing your slides that perhaps the era of the you know, kind of the large international heroic biennials and art fairs is drawing to a close. And perhaps, as you pointed out when discussing Marina's work, that COVID-19 has acted as a little bit of a dress rehearsal for the much larger crisis of climate change. And perhaps we've been given an opportunity, actually, as a sector to develop more sustainable ways of kind of creating that conviviality that you speak about, and choosing the right moment to kind of get on planes and gather together, and the right moment to do what we're doing, kind of now, which is, enabling an international conversation without, the damage that it causes to the planet. So in a way, perhaps, we can take some positives out of this strange kind of space and look forward to that hybrid future.
Yeah, no, I mean, institutional structures do change. I mean, this kind of festivalism of the last 25 years, and with the biennial in every city and an art fair in every city almost, that was not normal in the 50s or in the 60s even, or in the 70s. So it's something you get used, but these paradigms do actually emerge and change and disappear also, and suddenly they're gone. And I don't know exactly how this will happen, but I don't think you have to be Michel Foucault to understand that if you lock every individual on this planet into their own little apartment, and stop everyone from traveling, and you close down everything, plus you introduce new visual technologies that are quite powerful, and we haven't been talking about the whole blockchain world, which is something else. You introduce new currencies even. Well, you don't have to be Michel Foucault to understand that certain formations will change. And we haven't maybe seen the emergence yet of the future landscape, but we can probably predict the old ones slowly fading.
What a wonderful way to end tonight's discussion. Daniel, thank you so much for making time to take part in the Expanded Realities conversation series, for sharing kind of acute arts universe with us, but also your perspectives on how immersive technologies may be shaping a kind of a forming future. I'd like to thank all of you for joining today's live broadcast. As we shared, we'd love to hear your feedback, which you can post through the online survey, which we're about to share in the link that has just come up in the live chat, or by scanning the QR code at the top of the screen here. If you're in Singapore, please do come and visit the new VR gallery at Art Science Museum and experience Hyperrealities with the artworks by Marina Abramović, Olafur, Eliasson, and Anish Kapoor. These works we can speak about, we can show you pictures and videos as Daniel did today, but you really do need to be in that kind of VR environment to really feel the full force of what the artists are trying to convey. So please come and see the VR gallery. You can also stay up to date with everything that's happening at Art Science Museum and Art Science at Home, our online program, via our website, our Facebook page, and our YouTube channel. And we'll be announcing the upcoming lineup for the VR gallery through those mediums. So absolutely come and check them out. It's been great having all of you join us for the third talk in Expanded Realities Conversations. For now, stay safe, keep well, and be kind to each other. Good evening.
Thank you.